Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome back to our conference. My name is Pei-Shan Liu Snyder. I'm the moderator for this conference. So first, let me introduce our speaker, Helen Haskell. Helen Haskell is co-chair of the WHO Patients for Patient Safety Advisory Group and the president of the U.S. nonprofit patient organizations Mothers Against Medical Errors and the Consumers Advancing Patient Safety. Since the medical error death of her young son Louis in 2000, Helen has devoted herself to enhancing the patient's contribution to safety and quality in healthcare in areas ranging from medication safety and diagnostic accuracy to response to patient harm. She serves on the boards of directors of the Institute for Healthcare Improvement and the U.S. Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education, and on the board of advisors of the International Society for Rapid Response System. She has written numerous book articles, book chapters, and patient education materials, including a co-edited textbook of case studies in patient safety from the patient perspective. Her son Louis' story has been featured in education programs and videos including Transparent Health, Full-Length Louis Blackman Story. Helen holds a bachelor degree in classical studies from Duke University and a master's degree in anthropology from Rice University in the United States. Today, she will give a presentation on unsafe use of medications. We invite you to actively participate during this presentation. If you have any questions, please enter your question in the chat box. We'll respond to you as many as we can during this session. The rest of questions will be answered and published in our Q&A section of a Patient Safety Day on our webpage, isoponline.org. Please join me in welcoming Helen Haskell. Helen, I'm handing the meeting over to you.
Thank you, Pei-Shan. Let's see if I can get this up. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit today about what happens to patients after there is a medication error, which is something that often people don't know. Medication error seems as though it's something that happens in isolation. Pei-Shan has already introduced me. I work with a number of patient groups in the United States, as well as the WHO Patients for Patient Safety Advisory Group. So I'm going to start with a story about a healthy 15-year-old boy who went into the hospital for elective surgery and developed severe pain in his upper abdomen while being given an NSAID, IV ketorolac, and opiate by epidural. Nurses and residents didn't act on his increasing instability, which included 24 hours with no urine output and 4 hours with no detectable blood pressure. And 4 days after surgery, Louis died. The autopsy revealed a giant duodenal ulcer, which is a known and dreaded side effect of the NSAID pain medication he'd been taking. None of his caregivers had thought of this at all. This young man was my son, Louis. This happened a very long time ago now, but Louis was one of the top students in our state of South Carolina. Really one of the top students in the country. He was a young man of incredible talent and insight and compassion. We thought he was the most brilliant child in the world. We thought he would be one of the great men of the 21st century. So what happened with Louis was that he was given a full adult course of IV NSAIDs, although it was not approved for use in children, while he was already dehydrated. The junior doctor who was in charge of his care had certainly knew that he was dehydrated, but the first medication error was to give him a very low dose of IV fluids when he really needed a high dose, and then to give him ketorolac, which should not be given to people with low fluid volume. And then the second deadly error was that the side effects of the drug were not recognized. The fact that he was really seriously ill was not recognized. And he died, as most medical error victims do in hospital, from failure to rescue. He's one of millions. So some of the lessons from Lewis's case are that anyone who takes a high-risk medication is a high-risk patient. The assumption with Lewis was that he was a strong, healthy teenager and that really there couldn't be anything wrong with him. So his dire symptoms were ignored as they got worse and worse on the assumption that he was too strong and healthy and would pull out of it. And the other problem was that people really did not understand the specialized vital signs, dosing, and symptoms of children. And this is true. There are many specialized populations. Children and the elderly are probably the two largest ones. But medicine is dangerous when it is not personalized to the patient. So some of the structural issues in medication error, reasons that these things happen, drug labels, they're long, they're unreadable, they're confusing. People do not take black box warnings seriously. Providers constantly are prescribing drugs in violation of black box warnings because they don't think they really mean anything serious. So examples are antipsychotics in the elderly, antidepressants in teens and young people. And then other important warnings may be hidden in the fine print, as they were with Lewis. The low fluid volume on the label at that time was very far down in the label, so that even his anesthesiologist didn't know about it. And then the difficulty of getting orders changed, both inpatient and outpatient. Once something is in effect, it sticks like glue. It's very hard to get things changed. No one wants to change another healthcare provider's orders. Protocols are another big danger. Blood thinners, for example, are often part of standing orders. They're regularly given to specific sets of patients, even when as individuals, they may be at high risk from those medications. For example, stroke patients, often on the ward, they don't know that the person has had a hemorrhagic stroke rather than an ischemic one and may give them blood thinners. Nurses often dose patients with drugs for which they have standing orders because they are concerned about calling the doctor. This can be another danger. I've had several cases in which nurses gave patients benzodiazepines when they showed signs of opiate overdose, classifying it as anxiety, even though it doesn't look like anxiety, and that can push them over the edge and even be fatal. So drug reactions are the root cause of many serious medical errors. Here are a couple of examples. Antidepressants, which have a lot of undesirable side effects in spite of the fact that they are so widely prescribed. So, young man Michael Skolnick passed out while taking bupropion and Wellbutrin in the US for smoking cessation. He went to the emergency room. They had an incidental finding of a brain cyst. He underwent surgery, which left him blind, brain damaged, bedridden, psychotic, and unable to speak. And no cyst was ever found. After 3 years of profound disability, Michael died of a healthcare-associated infection at age 25. Mark Hofen, another young man about the same age, also took Wellbutrin to help stop smoking. When he passed out, he hit his head, sustained traumatic brain injury, and died in the ICU from another medication error. Anticoagulants are one. that I hear a lot about from patients. Curtis Bentley had a heart stent placed. And in the course of that, his warfarin prescription, according to protocol, was changed to Plavix, even though he had been very stable on warfarin for a number of years. And several days later, he was admitted to the hospital, to another hospital for gastric bleeding, had a cardiac arrest while unattended in the ICU, went into a coma, and was removed from life support 8 days later. Rita Washington was admitted to a hospital with bleeding after her doctor increased her warfarin dose. She had a reaction to a blood transfusion. A heart monitor after that indicated cardiac irregularities, and doctors implanted a pacemaker, which became infected and changed her life, led to 4 additional surgeries, chronic pain, lifelong disability. Finally, the pacemaker was removed with no adverse effect on her heart rhythm. She apparently never needed the pacemaker and was forced to take an early retirement because she could no longer work. So some of the common threads in these stories are, first of all, the misdiagnosis of the drug reaction. Healthcare providers do not consider the possibility that the patient's symptoms could be drug-induced, and that is very common. That leads to the cascade of drug reactions. So a treatable or temporary drug effect is mistaken for a serious medical condition, which leads to risky and sometimes deadly interventions. And the original adverse drug event, the link to the drug, is all but forgotten in the context of everything that happens thereafter. When patients die, autopsies are rare, and they seldom include toxicology. The people who are most interested in finding out what happened are the families, because prescribers fear liability, and they often just don't have the will to look too closely to think that they could have caused this. But families want answers, and they will pursue answers. In Lewis's case, for example, Ketorolac was not mentioned on the death certificate, wasn't mentioned in the autopsy report, wasn't mentioned anywhere in his records as a possible source of harm. The death summary was written by a second-year resident and perpetuated an earlier erroneous theory that she had that Lewis's deterioration was due to high potassium. Lewis's surgeon continued to say that he believed that Lewis's ulcer was caused by the stress of surgery, even though it was really a classic NSAID-induced ulcer. And no one reported the death to the manufacturer or to the FDA but us. Another issue, an even larger issue, is polypharmacy, which you may have heard about elsewhere during this conference. This is from the Lown Institute's recent report on medication overload in the United States. So in 1994, how many years ago is that? 26 years ago, 14% of people over 65 took 5 or more drugs. In 2014, 20 years later, nearly half of them, 42%, 4 in 10, took 5 or more drugs, and nearly half took 1 to 4 drugs. This is a huge consumption of drugs. Here's an example of a prescription cascade of an older patient. This was Joe Esposito, an eminent scientist who had Crohn's disease and was treated with over 20 medications, eventually died from a medication error, as a lot of people taking these particular drugs seem to do. Polypharmacy is really a global problem. In North America, Europe, and the Pacific, it occurs in anywhere from 1/3 to nearly 100% of residents in care homes. 1/4 of Germans over 65 and more than 1/3 of Canadians and Americans take at least one potentially inappropriate medication. That is one that should not be given to older patients. And studies from all over the world, including countries where you would think access to drugs might be the biggest problem, show similarly concerning rates of polypharmacy and use of potentially inappropriate medications among the elderly. In Latin America, we have studies from Brazil and Chile showing high rates of polypharmacy and potentially inappropriate medications, particularly in hospitals. In Canada, interestingly enough, 1 in 9 emergency department visits are caused by adverse drug events. 29% of these visits are for a repeat adverse drug event to the same drug that brought the same patient to the emergency room previously. The drugs are often represcribed by a community practitioner who is unaware of the previous event, that is, who has never been told, who got no feedback from the patient's previous hospitalization or visit to the emergency room. So among the factors affecting medication safety, a lot of it is in the prescribing phase, healthcare professionals, training and experience in the drugs they're using, their knowledge of drugs, their knowledge of the patients, their understanding of risk, in addition to personal qualities like in conditions like fatigue, overwork, their health physically and emotionally, their stress, and just how well they are communicating with other healthcare professionals and particularly with the patients. Patients end up doing the heavy lifting on medication safety in a lot of cases. They manage their own medications. They communicate between providers. They carry the messages. They have to maintain their own records, which not everyone knows they need to do. They need to alert people to adverse events and report the medication effects and adverse events. And patients have uniquely the ability to guide improvement in ways that matter to patients. But to do that, they need tools. So they need information on high-risk drugs. They need to know the signs of drug reaction, overdose. They need to know how to report an adverse drug reaction or medication incident, which most people don't know. They need to know where to find medication information easily. And we have found that if you want people to report adverse events in hospitals, the best way to do that is an exit interview, a personal interview before they leave the hospital. People are a lot more likely to respond to a personal conversation than they are to fill out a survey. So here's some of the resources available to patients. The deprescribing networks, and there are deprescribing networks in numerous countries. This is the Canadian one, which is a particularly effective one, I think. They're dedicated to raising awareness of medication safety. They have a lot of different initiatives, both with patients and providers, on how to reduce medications, particularly in older people. This is an example of an essay written for patients, telling them how to recognize a prescribing cascade and how to address it, how to talk to their providers and work together to get out of it. Another important resource is consumermedsafety.org, which is the consumer branch of ISMP. I believe you've heard from Mike Cohen already today. But this is one-stop shopping for patients. It has a lot of information on high-risk medications, as well as a portal through which you can report to the FDA. This is the American website. Globally, World Health Organization's latest patient safety challenge is medication without harm. And they are focusing on three areas for priority: high-risk situations, inappropriate polypharmacy, and transitions of care, which, as you saw in my earlier Canadian example, is a serious problem when people don't know what other providers have done. They also have 4 domains of patient safety. So areas where medication safety can be improved: patients in the public, healthcare professionals, medicines, symptoms and practices of medication. And these are the areas within the domains in which the WHO has marked for improvement. So with patients, which we're focusing on here, it's involvement of patient organizations with medication safety, which is important because often the patient organizations are not aware of the risk. Patient reporting, which is critical, patient engagement at the bedside, and public awareness and medication literacy, which is profoundly lacking almost everywhere. Sir Liam Donaldson, who was really the driving force behind this patient safety challenge and much of the patient safety work at WHO, says, over the years, I've spoken to many people who've lost loved ones to medication-related errors. Their stories, their quiet dignity, their acceptance of situation that never should have arisen have moved me deeply. He dedicates the challenge to the memories of those who have died due to incidents of unsafe care. Some of the materials that are available from this challenge: there are videos, there are all sorts of printed materials. There are 3 excellent technical reports on each of the 3 priority areas. There are patient materials, 5 moments for medication safety, mirroring our earlier 5 moments for hand hygiene, what patients should do at different points along the medication safety journey, with an app in which they can keep records and record what they have a reminder of these 5 moments and keep records of what they need to do at each one. Most critically, I think, is patient reporting of all the recommendations of the WHO challenge for patients. Patient reporting yields vastly different outcomes from doctor-reported outcomes. Ethan Bush has done a lot of work on this in the United States. And his conclusion is that clinicians systematically downgrade symptoms compared with what patients think. Patient adverse symptom reports correlate better with the patient's functional status than the clinician reports do, which is really not surprising if you think about it, because it is a first-person report rather than a second-hand report. And he also did a 10-year study showing that cancer patients whose treatment is guided by their own reports of chemotherapy effects have significantly longer lifespans than others who are just given standard treatment. Patient reporting also reveals errors and near misses that aren't recorded anywhere else in the medical record and incident reports and any other record from the hospital. So these are 2 examples. One is pediatrics, parents reporting medical errors in the children's hospital, nearly half of which were not documented in the medical record. And one of the classic studies, Weissman and et al., 2008, patients from 16 Boston hospitals reported 229 adverse events, of which 23% were not recorded anywhere in the hospital's records, including over a third of serious preventable in-hospital events. And what is striking about that is that most of those events involved medications, over half. Patients in hospitals often nobody understands that what is happening to them is a medication reaction, and it's just dismissed. So here's an example of a family that took things into their own hands, that took action and really took charge of their own care. So Fervid Trimble, who was an 86-year-old woman in a retirement home, started to develop bizarre mental symptoms and a movement disorder after she was sent to the infirmary for the flu. Um, the family checked her drugs and learned that she had been started on both an antidepressant and the pain drug tramadol, neither of which she'd been taking before. The medical staff didn't connect her symptoms with the medications, even though the two of them, you know, gave her a very high load of serotonin in the family. From doing research online, suspected serotonin syndrome. The medical staff had planned to give her more medications to treat these side effects. But once the medications were stopped, she regained her mental capabilities, but she was very weakened from weeks of immobility from these drugs and could never return to independent living. The World Health Assembly last year made patient safety a priority, which is why we are here today for Patient Safety Day. And again, one of their priorities was reporting, learning, and feedback systems, incorporating the perspectives of patients and their families, which is so important. Um, so if you look at these reporting systems, a lot of countries do have the ability for patients to report adverse drug events. The first systems were largely confined to professionals. They came online in the 1960s after the thalidomide disaster. Then in the 2000s, the early 2000s, some European countries started opening their reporting systems up to consumers and developing special reporting mechanisms for consumers. In 2012, the EU required all member states to implement consumer reporting systems. So now there are a lot of countries. The most recent study that I've seen has, I believe, 44 to 46 countries that allow patient reporting explicitly. But the methods and the uptake of this are really variable. It's not always easy for patients to report. Some of the things that have come from consumer reporting in European countries, some of the associations that have been really solidified by consumer reports are the association between the pandemic's influenza vaccine and narcolepsy. The fact that sexual side effects of SSRI antidepressants can continue and be permanent after the antidepressant has been discontinued. The, I think, very difficult association to make between pathological gambling and Parkinson's medications, and then the seriousness of electric shock sensations associated with SSRIs. While those were known, it was the patient reports that really showed what a severe side effect this is. The big differences between patient and professional reports, not just as I was saying earlier, that patients sort of see more in their own conditions than doctors do, but their reports are more detailed, much longer than doctors' accounts. They report known side effects, which doctors often don't bother to do, and add to the knowledge of the nature and the severity of those effects. They really have a different concept of what constitutes a severe adverse reaction. And I think this is just a different response to harm and to medical treatment in general by patients. They are interested in their global well-being as opposed to the effect of that particular treatment on that particular symptom. So their concern is the impact of the adverse drug reaction on their lives. Patient reports give context. They shed light on off-label use, on inappropriate prescribing and how the patients are actually taking the drugs. So what comes next? I think we have a big challenge in terms of public awareness of reporting systems. In most countries, patients are woefully unaware of the ability to report. And even when they vaguely know that you can, they don't know how. It's a big challenge. People need to learn how to do it, even though in some countries, like UK and the Netherlands, most adverse drug event reports do come from patients. It's still only a tiny, tiny portion of the public that knows they can do this. The opportunity, I think, is in big data research networks like the I don't know if I'm saying this right, the Eden study in the EU, EPIC network in the US, there are many more, getting real world data in ways that, that show what's happening to patients actually. You could tracking the patients and seeing the long-term adverse events. And I think the real opportunity will be combining this information from the electronic records with spontaneous reports by patients and providers. I mean, even now, the spontaneous reports, when you combine patient and provider reports, there's a synergy, and more signals emerge from those combined reports than from either data set alone. When you put that together with real world data from the EHR, and then the holy grail for patients to also be able to provide input to write in the EHR, in the electronic health record, then you have the information you need to really make prescribing patient-oriented to the individual and outcome-oriented for that individual. And then you have a real learning network. You have a culture of safety. And you can only have a culture of safety if you have patients as partners, as part of that, because they are the critical people who can report errors, who can collaborate, and who can help you learn from mistakes. Thank you. Hey, Sean, over to you.
Thank you very much, Helen, for your presentation. And let's take a look at questions from a participant. So the first question, I think you have touched upon a lot from the patient perspective. So we are in a digital era with so many digital tools, platform available. So how can we utilize those tools and platforms to improve patient safety and also reduce medical and medication errors?
You know, I think it's a lot of what I was saying earlier. I think that the combination of all these different sources of data is what will really give us the context and sort of pull back the veil from what is going on with medications and treatments and how they're affecting patients' lives. And it will allow patients to really understand you know, what they want out of these drugs, because often they don't know. They don't really know the purpose of the drug. So I think that it really just creates an enormous opportunity. We're on the cusp of something that could really be done well, but it requires a commitment to transparency on the part of everybody, and it requires education, I think, on the part of for everybody, for both providers and patients and others, to really learn more about drugs.
Thank you. Here's another question. Thank you very much, Helen, for being here and sharing your story. And so from your perspective as a family member and a patient, do you perceive a real interest from a clinician and healthcare provider to work and seek real strategy to minimize medication errors?
I don't. I think the people who work there are a handful of very dedicated people who work in this area. But my impression is that it is a small, hardy band of people that really healthcare providers are not taught enough about risk and about the potential adverse effects of medications so that both providers and patients end up believing that there's only benefit from medications. No one really has respect for the power of medications um, to do harm. So I think this is something that needs to go back into the professional schools, into education. I don't think that, and until people are really taught to have a different perspective on medications, we're not going to get that wave of participation and enthusiasm.
Thank you, Helen. I think you just briefly, actually, you talk a lot about in your presentation about the polypharmacy, medication overload. So there is a growing concern over this polypharmacy. So what are the possible solutions to address this concern?
Well, again, I think it is education, and perhaps in this case, we need to start with the public. Um, a lot of things have been empowerment of patients, empowerment of pharmacists who have a much higher sense of how risky this might be. I really can't think of another solution because polypharmacy really just stems from people not understanding the risk of drugs and the risk of combining them. People are not taught the right things.
Thank you, Helen. So here is another question. So in today's world, in hospitals fear litigation. So what's your advice to promote or push for transparency and honest communication between the patients and with patients about the medication errors?
So the push for transparency, I think it really needs to come from, that's another reason that I think that big data is such a hopeful solution. Because right now, providers, often they don't know when an adverse reaction has occurred, but they're also fearful about reporting it, very fearful. So if it's simply reported in the records and is taken out of the hands, A, you take the burden of reporting off of the providers, and B, you get better information. And if you back that up with reporting from both patients and providers, which that could be anonymous, then I think you can get a pretty full data set. So that would be my solution. I've almost never, litigation over medication errors is very rare. I think because there is such wide latitude, and there shouldn't be such wide latitude, but it's something that simply shouldn't happen. I don't think, there should be guardrails in place to prevent it from happening. So so that litigation is just not even an issue. Hello?
Hello, Helen, and thank
Okay.
you. Yep. So we have another question here. Thank you for your emotional presentation. So how can, what can we do to help patients actively report the adverse events?
I think that it really takes a public campaign, and that has not been done, partly because it's expensive. but I think there may be ways that are not so expensive, like leaflets in doctors' offices. Um, I don't know. I mean, I think the expense of a public campaign is has been a real barrier on this. So maybe, you know, again, it's education that doctors need to know more, be able to talk to patients, that there should be things like leaflets in doctors' offices, that online resources should somehow be easier to access. When you get, you know, the excellent information that's available at the World Health Organization or someplace like ISMP, the Institute for Safe Medicine Practices, um, people don't know that's there, and they should. And they don't know that the reporting um, portals are there. I can remember after my son's adverse event, I had no idea where to report things. Um, it it was quite intimidating, and you know, we were not faint-hearted about that sort of thing, but I could imagine that some people would be. So it all needs to be more more open, more public, posted on walls, perhaps. I don't know. People need to be creative, but it needs to be a public campaign.
Thank you. We have a question from Mexico. So in Mexico, the use of drugs at an outpatient level is far from being well regulated. The community pharmacies that function without a pharmaceutical manager, the great challenge that pharmacists face in our society is that not being fully considered as health care professional. Therefore, patients receive pharmaceutical advice or adequate pharmaceutical care. So what advice do you give the pharmaceutical union that face this problem?
You know, I have seen this problem for so long that the pharmacist, who often has much better knowledge of the drugs, as you would expect, than the prescribing physician, um, doesn't have the authority to challenge the physician. And the patient believes the physician over the pharmacist because everybody's sort of um, buying into the hierarchy, so to speak. Um, you know, I I don't know the political realities and the interactions between these various professional groups, but I think a pharmaceutical union probably has a little bit of clout, and again, maybe they just need to give patients more advice. I don't know how you can get pharmaceutical managers into pharmacies that don't have them and aren't required to have them. So um, maybe some sort of regulatory approach is needed. I wish you luck. I mean, I think it's a critical issue, and I know it's widespread throughout the world. Um, and all I can say is that everyone needs to learn to speak up, and again, that there needs to be education with interprofessional education from the beginning, that doctors and nurses learn to respect other professions.
Thank you. Um, I think on top of that, and there is another question. I'm sorry for your loss, and young Lewis passed away 20 years ago. So what progress, in your opinion, that has been made over the last 20 years to reduce medical and medication errors?
You know, I think there's been so much progress. We've got in countries that have computerization. I mean, we have computerized physician order entry, we have armband scanning, we have lots of precautions for nurses in hospitals. You know, wearing special aprons, having special places, having quiet zones, double checking high risk medications. We have computer assisted prescribing, we have decision aids, we have alerts. But this is in hospitals. It's mostly in hospitals. And even in hospitals, it's not sufficient to prevent a lot of bad things from happening. And I think that, medication safety has really been treated, if you think about it, um, at least in the treatment area, it's been treated as a nursing problem and a hospital problem. And that's really not where the problem lies. The problem's in the prescribing more than the administration. Not that all these safeguards around administration aren't really important to have and helpful, but the problem is more often prescriber error that does not necessarily get caught, even if you have computers, with alerts and decision aids. And it's often in the outpatient arena where, most prescribing occurs. So there are too many drugs. People don't understand their side effects, let alone their interactions. They have too little time. Um, they don't have time to look everything up and think about it. And in many countries, I know, things aren't even prescribed. So people are just sort of using their best guess to get something from the pharmacy. So there's been a lot of progress in hospitals in high income countries, but elsewhere, I think we have a long way to go.
Thank you. Here's another question from a participant. What advice would you give in a high-power cultures and where but patients are less outspoken and fear to challenge their doctors?
That is a good question. And I think it's true almost everywhere. People are always fearful to challenge their doctors. Even doctors are fearful to challenge their doctors. There's something about that situation that intimidates almost everybody. And I, I think that really, I think patients need to try to sort of, gird their loins and gather up their courage and ask. But I know that sometimes that can be seen as challenging, and it can have the opposite effect from what you intended. Again, I think the solution is professional education. Um, I think doctors need to learn to deal with patients in a different way, and we need to have a situation in which they can. I know that in so many places, doctors' time is so compressed that they really can't they can't spend adequate time with any one patient, which is a terrible situation. So I'm not giving much advice. I think you just the other thing that patients can do is do their own research. I will say that. Um, you can do your own research and try to figure out the best way that you should take something and whether there is an interaction. If there's a risk, you could probably find it out by doing research.
Thank you, Helen. Next question. I think this one is from a patient and a caregiver's perspective. So when serious medical and medication errors occur, and typically that patients and caregivers are in a very sad situation. So what's your suggestion that to go from the sad situation to taking action?
To go from which situation to taking action? I'm sorry.
From this sad situation, when a serious or severe medication or medical error occur?
To go from
what motivate them, I guess, to really get out of that sad situation and actually take actions and do something about it?
to get out of the situation of medication error, if there is a medication error or in general?
Yes, when there is a medication error.
When there is a medication error, I think It depends on the error. I mean, some are deadly, and some are just inconvenient, and there's everything in between. I do think I firmly believe in the importance of patients doing their own research, and that's not to discredit doctors. It's that the patient has one patient. The doctors have many. Doctors are trying to come up with a solution on the spot in 10 minutes or so. A patient can spend a lot of time doing research and figure out what's going on. I hear a lot about bad information on the internet, and I don't encounter it. Um, People tell me that's because I don't look in those places to begin with, and so the algorithms are not geared toward me finding inaccurate information. Well, maybe that's true. I don't know. But I do think there's very good information on the internet. A lot of it geared toward patients and very readable. Um, and if people have smartphones, um, they can find that. If they can get to, a website like the World Health Organization or Institute for Safe Medication Practices, they can find good information, or even just, Googling the name of the drug. But once you have a reaction, I think you know, you need to address it. Um, so I think you need to go back to your doctor if you need treatment for it, because otherwise it could progress. It could not end well. And one of the problems that I do see is that doctors are often so reluctant, so fearful of liability that, and this is what I encounter in the U.S. that um, the patients sometimes have a hard time getting treatment if there has been an error, and it's an obvious error. Other doctors also don't want to get involved, so it can be a problem, and you really have to, at a time when you're very weak and vulnerable, you have to be really strong and fight, and that's more than a lot of people can do. That's not a very optimistic answer to your question, um, but I think research and just persisting, I think, are the two things and to report the error, of course.
Thank you. Here's another question. So if a pharmacist is the healthcare professional with a wide knowledge in pharmacology, toxicology, and drug interactions, so why sometimes their advice and suggestions are not taken into account, especially in polypharmacy and elderly patients and children's and so on and so forth?
Why is the knowledge of pharmacists not taken into account?
Right, their advice and suggestions not taken into account.
I think it is because of this hierarchy that persists in people's minds, that the physician is at the top of the hierarchy and the pharmacist is somewhere below that. And even though the pharmacist is specialized in knowledge about medications, that doesn't, people don't know it. And they know that they're specialized, but they still believe that the doctor somehow takes precedence. The doctor knows something that the pharmacist doesn't, which of course we all have our specialized knowledge. The doctors do know something that the pharmacist doesn't, but the pharmacist knows things that the doctor doesn't. And, interprofessional education, learning to flatten the hierarchy, I think these are all things we have to look for in the future. Once you have sort of equalized input from pharmacists, doctors, patients, nurses, everybody involved, then you can get good medical care. Um, I think pharmacists need to perhaps I don't know. Yeah, people need to know more about the expertise of pharmacists. I agree. And I would like to see that publicized. So maybe there's something that pharmacists as a group could do there.
Thank you very much, Helen. And those are all the questions from our participant. And so with that, we'll conclude our conference. And thank you all for your participation.
Thank you.